In this video, we're going to take a look at the different constitutional concepts that are critical to understand just when we're talking about our legal system and the federal government in particular. We're going to start off with the Supremacy Clause, which is more and more prevalent in the news these days because of some of the laws that have been passed by individual states. But the Supremacy Clause, which can be found in the 6th article of the U.S. Constitution, states that the laws and actions of state or local governments cannot conflict with federal law or with the Constitution. Okay, and one example of this, when we're looking for examples, is the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and the state of Washington. Okay, and I'm going to play a little video clip here that kind of describes the quandary that is created when a state passes a law similar to this.
Voters in Colorado and Washington passed measures last month to legalize recreational marijuana use, putting state laws in conflict with federal law, but it's not the first time that's happened. 17 states have already legalized medical marijuana, even though federal law says marijuana has no medically acceptable use. So what happens when state and federal laws are in conflict? Under the Supremacy Clause of Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, the federal courts can lock you up for carrying a small bag of marijuana, even if state law says otherwise. But first you have to be prosecuted, and other than some very limited attempts, the feds have not gone after people who are prescribed marijuana by a doctor. Will federal prosecutors view the recreational use measures differently? State officials say federal officials have not indicated whether they'll bring suit to stop the measures. It's too soon to know whether the laws will go up in smoke.
Now, the legalization of marijuana is one example, and that's where a federal law is in effect, and a state or local law contradicts it. There's another situation going on in New Jersey in which the legislature and the governor combined together to legalize sports betting in Atlantic City casinos and at the state racetracks. In other words, you could bet on a football game, a basketball game, a baseball game, which typically is not legal other than in Las Vegas and in a couple other states. But the Supremacy Clause kicks in because there's a 1992 federal law that banned sports gambling in all states that didn't already have legalized gambling on the books. So at that point, Nevada, Delaware, Montana, and Oregon. And so the Judicial Department came down hard on New Jersey and basically is trying to stop that law from taking effect, and that's currently being looked at by the U.S. Supreme Court. But it doesn't have to be a law. It could be the Constitution itself, the Bill of Rights itself. For example, if one state passed a law that banned guns completely, that would be in conflict with the Constitution, okay, with the Second Amendment that gives people the right to bear arms. It could be something that contradicts a Supreme Court precedent. So, for example, Roe versus Wade was the Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion, which means that no state individually can ban abortion completely. Now, that doesn't mean, whether we're talking about gun control or abortion, that there can't be restrictions placed upon those two things, but you can't just outlaw them, because to do so would violate the Supremacy Clause. And so, when we talk about the Supremacy Clause, it becomes an issue of kind of federal government versus state and local governments. Now, separation of powers. Really, all we're looking at here is the power possessed by each branch of the government within the legal system. And so we look at what role each plays. And this is kind of a review as much as anything, because we know that the legislative branch creates law, the judicial branch interprets the law, and the executive branch enforces the law. And that's what we're talking about with separation of powers for our purpose in here. It's just the idea of which branch does what within our legal system. Checks and balances. Now, we don't think of this necessarily as a grouping, but checks and balances is the system through which each branch of government prevents the other branches from becoming too powerful. And there are different ways that this occurs, and we've talked about some of them already. basically we kind of look at how each branch can check the power of the others. Like if we start off with the president, the executive branch, the president has the ability to check the power of the legislative branch through veto power. And we're going to come back and explain that in a little more detail in a minute. But they also have the power to check the judicial branch because all federal judges are nominated by the president. And so the executive branch does have power over the other two. The judicial branch also has power over the other two branches. They have power over the president, even though the president is the person who nominates members of the Supreme Court. Once those people are on the Supreme Court, they're appointed for life, and that allows them to check the power of the executive branch because Supreme Court justices are nominated for life and don't have to be concerned with what the president thinks about their decisions. In other words, they don't have to try to create job security by agreeing with the president all the time. They also check the power of the legislative branch because if the legislative branch oversteps their power and creates a law that violates the Constitution, it can be overturned through judicial review. So the courts have the final say as to whether or not a law is constitutional. And then finally, the legislative branch checks the executive branch due to their power to impeach. And we're going to take a look at that in a couple minutes. And then also the legislative branch checks the judicial branch since only they can confirm federal judges, including members of the Supreme Court, because the Senate has to confirm any nominees sent to them by the president. Okay, but let's look at a couple of these situations in particular. Let's start with veto power. We've already talked about it quickly, but just to in the past, but just to kind of go through it. Basically, for a bill to pass to the president, a couple things have to occur first. The bill has to be passed by a majority in both the House and the Senate, and then it becomes law when it's signed by the president. However, if the president refuses to sign, he is said to veto or reject the bill. And so the president has the power, if he disagrees with Congress, to veto and prevent that law from becoming that bill from becoming a law. However, that doesn't mean it's dead. Congress can override the presidential veto by now what takes a 2/3 majority vote in each house. So that's the only way to override a presidential veto. It doesn't happen very often, but it is actually an example of how each branch checks the power of the others. Now, as far as impeachment, which is one of the most important responsibilities that Congress has, impeachment can be used not only on a president, but a Supreme Court justice, a federal judge. Okay, people can be impeached based on charges of high crimes and misdemeanors. And we're going to focus on the president because I'm going to show you a little video clip that summarizes the Clinton impeachment that took place in 1999. But these charges are brought and they have to be voted on by the House of Representatives in the Judicial Committee and then the House itself. And these charges are called articles of impeachment. And basically an article of impeachment is like a criminal charge. If you're charged with burglary, aggravated assault, and kidnapping, those would be 3 separate criminal charges. The same thing occurs when we look at articles of impeachment. They're like 3 separate charges brought against the president or whomever is being impeached. And really there is no definition to high crimes and misdemeanors. It's basically however the House of Representatives defines it. Okay, but once these charges are voted on by the House, and once they pass these articles of impeachment, there is a trial held, and that trial is held in the Senate. Members of the House Judiciary Committee act as the prosecution team. And so members of the House will prosecute the case. Obviously the president or whoever else would be impeached is able to bring in attorneys of their own. But the Senate's the courtroom. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court acts as the judge, and the Senate acts as the jury. And for the president or whomever is being impeached to be convicted, it requires a 2/3 majority vote, and conviction on any one of the articles of impeachment results in removal for office. But there is kind of that misconception that if a president is impeached, that they've been removed or will be removed from office, and that's not true. They also have to be convicted in the Senate trial. And so that's just kind of a summary of our Lesson 6, constitutional concepts. And I'm going to show you a video about President Clinton and his impeachment. But after that video, then you can move on to the review for the Unit 1 test.
President of the United States is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
It was 10 years ago.
Perjurious, misleading, and untruthful.
Mr. Speaker, this is wrong, wrong, wrong.
The impeachment of a president. It had been tawdry and tortured, this becoming this.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
But it was really about truth and consequences.
I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false.
But they weren't.
The ayes have it.
Monica Lewinsky, a young White House intern, and the president had what was politely called inappropriate contact. He got into trouble for what he told investigators.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
The evidence suggests that the president repeatedly used the machinery of government and the powers of his high office to conceal his relationship.
The scandal divided the country.
A nation of laws cannot be ruled by a person who breaks the law.
When will this mindless cannibalism end? How many good public officials must be destroyed because of their private sins and human imperfections?
It paralyzed the presidency and made their private lives and foibles painfully public. It became about survival, so the Clintons circled the wagons and went on the offensive.
The great story here, for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it, is this vast right-wing conspiracy that has been conspiring against my husband since the day he announced for president.
The impeachment hearings, live and in graphic detail, capped a year of this. The House voted to impeach, but the Senate did not convict. He's worked ever since to reclaim his reputation. She's run the marathon and has gained influence. But there will always be that history, and private lives will always be the quicksand of American politics.